The night of October 31st, 1944, Halloween, presented what seemed like a perfect opportunity for German prisoners of war held in the United States, with American guards potentially distracted by holiday celebrations and with people in costumes roaming around. A group of POWs conceived what they thought was a clever escape plan. They would disguise themselves in American clothing, blend in with any Halloween festivities or costumed civilians, and make their way to freedom. The plan had a certain logic to it, or at least it might have seemed that way after the prisoners had been drinking. What actually happened became one of the most embarrassing and poorly executed escape attempts of the entire war, a comedy of errors that demonstrated how difficult it was for German POWs to successfully escape from camps in the American heartland. The United States held hundreds of thousands of German and Italian prisoners of war during World War II, with POWs scattered across camps throughout the country. These camps were located far from the coasts, often in rural areas of the Midwest and South, where escape would be extremely difficult, even if a prisoner managed to get out of the camp itself. The vast distances involved, the unfamiliarity with American geography, the language barrier, and the simple fact that a German accent would immediately mark someone as foreign made successful escape nearly impossible. Most German POWs recognized this reality and settled into camp life, working on farms or in other labor details, waiting for the war to end so they could go home. But some prisoners still attempted escape, driven by a sense of duty, boredom, desperation, or in some cases, alcohol-fueled overconfidence. The Geneva Conventions actually stated that it was the duty of a prisoner of war to attempt escape if possible, and German military culture emphasized this obligation. However, there was a difference between making a legitimate escape attempt and the farcical effort that unfolded on Halloween 1944. The prisoners involved in this particular escape had somehow obtained alcohol, though the exact source remains unclear from historical records. Alcohol was officially prohibited in POW camps, but prisoners were resourceful and occasionally managed to brew their own or acquire it from outside sources. Whatever the origin of the liquor, several German POWs spent the evening drinking and discussing the possibility of escape. Halloween seemed to offer unique opportunities. Americans would be wearing costumes and masks. There might be parties and celebrations that would distract guards. People dressed in unusual clothing wouldn't attract immediate attention because it was Halloween. The prisoners assembled what they believed were convincing American disguises. The exact details of these costumes vary depending on which account you read, but they apparently included civilian clothing that the prisoners had either made, stolen, or obtained through trade with other prisoners, or perhaps even sympathetic guards. Some reports suggest the escapees wore suits or work clothes, trying to look like ordinary American civilians. The critical flaw in their thinking was that they believed these disguises would be sufficient to allow them to walk out of the camp and disappear into American society. The escape attempt began after dark on Halloween night. The exact number of prisoners involved is disputed in various accounts, but it appears to have been somewhere between 3 and 7 men. They had presumably identified a weakness in the camp's perimeter security, or had a plan for getting past the fences and guards. In their intoxicated state, the obstacles that had kept them imprisoned seemed surmountable. The disguises seemed adequate. The plan seemed sound. They made their move. What the drunk German POWs failed to adequately consider were the numerous problems with their scheme. First, while Halloween costumes were certainly common among children and at parties, adults wandering around in the vicinity of a POW camp late at night would attract attention regardless of what they were wearing. Second, their German accents, which would be immediately obvious to anyone they spoke to, were not something that could be disguised by wearing American clothes. Third, their understanding of American culture and customs was limited at best. Fourth, camp guards were aware that holidays presented potential opportunities for escape attempts and were likely to be more alert rather than less. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, they were drunk, which impaired their judgment and coordination at precisely the time when they needed to be at their most careful and clever. The escape itself appears to have gone wrong almost immediately. Various accounts suggest that the prisoners either were spotted by guards while attempting to leave the camp, or they managed to get outside the perimeter but were caught very shortly afterward. The exact sequence of events is difficult to reconstruct from available historical sources, as the incident was apparently not considered significant enough to warrant detailed official reporting. It was, after all, just another failed escape attempt among thousands during the war, notable primarily for its incompetence, rather than for posing any actual security threat. What is clear is that the escapees were apprehended quickly, likely within hours if not minutes of their attempt. They had not made it far from the camp. Their intoxication had been obvious to the guards who caught them. The entire episode was over almost before it began, leaving the would-be escapees facing punishment and humiliation, rather than freedom. The punishment for escape attempts varied depending on the circumstances, but typically involved time and solitary confinement in what prisoners called the cooler, a disciplinary barracks where prisoners were isolated from the general population. The duration might range from a few days to several weeks depending on the severity of the attempt and whether any rules beyond simply trying to escape had been violated. In this case, the prisoners had likely violated camp rules regarding alcohol consumption, in addition to attempting escape, which might have increased their punishment. The incident highlights several aspects of the POW experience in America during World War II. Despite being far from home and technically imprisoned, many German POWs had relatively comfortable conditions by the standards of wartime imprisonment. They received adequate food, medical care, and housing. They were generally treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. Many worked outside the camps on farms or in other civilian jobs, where labor was scarce due to American men being in military service. Some developed friendly relationships with American civilians and guards. This relatively benign imprisonment meant that the motivation to escape was often lower than it might have been in harsher conditions. However, alcohol consumption, when prisoners could obtain it, sometimes led to poor decisions. Drinking allowed prisoners to temporarily forget their circumstances, to feel brave and clever, to convince themselves that impossible plans might actually work. The Halloween escape attempt was almost certainly the product of this kind of alcohol-fueled false confidence. Sober, the prisoners involved would likely have recognized the numerous flaws in their plan. Drunk, those flaws seemed surmountable, or perhaps weren't considered at all. The choice of Halloween as an escape date also reveals something about how German POWs understood or misunderstood American culture. Halloween was indeed a holiday involving costumes, but it was primarily a children's holiday in the 1940s, quite different from the adult-focused celebration it has become in more recent decades. The idea that adults in costumes would be common enough to provide cover for escaping POW suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of how the holiday was actually celebrated. This kind of cultural gap was common among POWs, who learned about American life through limited interactions with guards, from American movies shown in camps, and from whatever information they could glean from newspapers and radio. The broader context of German POW escapes in America shows why this particular attempt was doomed from the start. There were numerous escape attempts from American POW camps during the war, with estimates ranging into the thousands of individual attempts. However, successful escapes, defined as prisoners who remained at large for extended periods, or who actually managed to leave the country, were extraordinarily rare. The vast majority of escapees were recaptured within days, if not hours. The geography of America worked against escapees. Camps were deliberately located far from ports, borders, and major cities. A prisoner escaping from a camp in Kansas or Texas or Georgia faced hundreds or thousands of miles of travel to reach Mexico, Canada, or a coast where they might somehow find a ship. They had no money, no transportation, limited knowledge of the terrain, and no support network. Every interaction with an American civilian was a risk, as their accent would immediately mark them as foreign and suspicious. Even the few prisoners who managed to evade immediate recapture found that surviving on the run in America was virtually impossible. They couldn't get jobs without papers. They couldn't buy food without money. They couldn't travel without being noticed. Small town and rural America in the 1940s was a place where strangers were immediately obvious, where everyone knew everyone else, and where a person with a German accent would be reported to authorities almost instantly. The FBI tracked escaped POWs and generally recaptured them quickly. There were a handful of cases where German POWs managed to remain free for months, but these were exceptional. One famous case involved a prisoner who worked on a farm and developed a relationship with the farmer's family, who helped hide him after he escaped. But even in this case, he was eventually discovered and returned to custody. The idea that escaped German POWs could simply disappear into American society was fantasy, yet prisoners continued to attempt escape, driven by duty, desperation, or in cases like the Halloween incident, by alcohol and poor judgment. The Halloween escape attempt, with its combination of drinking, costumes, and immediate failure, became the kind of story that guards and other POWs would have repeated as an example of foolishness. It represented everything wrong with poorly planned, impulsive escape attempts. It demonstrated how alcohol impaired judgment. It showed the futility of trying to disguise oneself as American when fundamental things like accent and cultural knowledge would immediately give away the deception. For the prisoners involved, the incident must have been deeply embarrassing. Not only had they failed to escape, but they had failed in such an obvious and foolish way that they became a source of mockery. Their fellow POWs would have known about the attempt and its ridiculous elements. The guards certainly would have found it amusing. The prisoners had gone from being soldiers and combatants worthy of respect to being the subjects of jokes about drunk Germans in Halloween costumes trying to escape. The incident also illustrates the strange nature of POW camps in America during World War II. These were places where deadly enemies were held in relatively comfortable circumstances in the American heartland, where some of the greatest dangers were boredom and the temptation to make foolish decisions like trying to escape while drunk on Halloween. The contrast between the brutal combat occurring in Europe and the Pacific and the relatively benign existence of POWs in America was stark. Men who had fought in desperate battles now found themselves working on farms in Iowa or Texas. Their greatest adventure, a drunken escape attempt that failed almost before it started. The Halloween 1944 escape attempt by drunk German POWs wearing what they thought were convincing American disguises stands as a minor footnote in the history of World War II. Significant primarily as an example of the kind of foolish, poorly conceived plans that prisoners occasionally hatched. It shows how desperation, boredom, alcohol, and cultural misunderstanding could combine to produce a scheme that had no realistic chance of success. It demonstrates that even in war, even in imprisonment, human foolishness finds ways to express itself. And it serves as a reminder that not all military history consists of dramatic battles and strategic decisions. Sometimes it's just drunk prisoners in bad costumes, getting caught almost immediately while trying to escape on Halloween.